Okay, we're on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Aleph. We're on the Mishnah at the top of the Amid. The Mishnah is continuing with telling us the procedure for making the carbon minchas. So the Mishnah says, Kol ha-menachos, all minchas tu'una shalosh mea shifa. They have to rub, a certain part of the mincha had to be rubbed 300 times. V'chamish me'es bita, and it had to be pounded 500 times. Now what is the 300 and the 500? I might explain there was like a pattern, but it had to do 3 and 500. Now, Shiva b'ita b'chitin. The Tanna Kama believes that this was by the wheat. They would take the wheat and they would rub it 300 times and pound it and pound it 500 times. That would soften it. Rav Yossi says no, it's bedoh. It's bebetzek. It's by the dough. The dough had to be rubbed and pounded that amount of time. Now, all minchas bois eser. The Tanna Kama, this is Rav Yehuda, he believes that all carbon minchas were split into 10 loaves. Chutz melechem, similar to the carbon toida, which had 10 loaves. Chutz melechem aponim mechavite kohen gadol, except for the lechem aponim chavite kohen gadol, the kohen gadol's chavitin, and the lechem aponim shimbos shteim esrei, which are 12. So basically, everyone agrees the toida is 10. Everyone agrees that the lechem aponim are 12. The question is, what is the standard? So Rabbi Yehuda says the standard is 10 compared to the toida. Rav Meir says no. Kulam b'oy shteim esrei. No. Everything is learned out from the lechem aponim, or the chavitim, that it's 12. And the only one that's 10 is Chalos Toida Naziris, the Lachme Toida, and the Nazir's carbon, which are 10. So everyone agrees the Lachme Toida and the Naziris are 10. Everyone agrees the Lechem Aponim and the Chavita Kohen Gadol are 12. The question is everything else. If you compare from then, it's 10. If you compare to that, it's 12. And that's going to be the Gemara's Machlekes. Tana. So we said in the Mishnah that it had to be rubbed and pounded 300 and 500 times respectively. So the way they would do is like this: shav achas, they would rub once, and bayit shtayim, and then pound it twice, and then they would do shav shtayim, rub twice, ubayit shalish. So that would be 3 rubbings and 5 poundings, and they would repeat that 100 times. The question is, when we consider rubbing it, when you're counting the 300 times, is going it forward a rub, or forward and backwards is once? Meaning it's forward and backwards. When you rub, let's say, the kernels, you put your hand forward and then backwards. Is that considered 2 or is that considered 1? Teku. Not sure. Shiva b'ita b'chitin, Rav Yossi b'betzek. The machlokes, Rav Yossi says they would rub and pound the dough. So the question is, he boile b'betzek v'lo b'chitin, or dimaf b'betzek. Is Rav Yossi adding to the Tanna Kama or disagreeing? Does Rav Yossi agree that this amount of pounding and rubbing has to happen with the wheat, and he's saying that it also has to happen by the dough, or is it dough and not wheat? So the Gemara says the lashon of the Braisa seems to indicate that it's a machlokes. Tashim Adatanya Shiva b'ita b'chitin. The Tanna Kama says the rubbing and pounding was with the wheat, and Rav Yossi Ayma Shiva b'ita b'betzek. No, it's in the dough, not the wheat. So it's a machlokes. Okay, so I told you in the Mishnah that you have the lechem aponim is 12, the Chavita Kohen Gadol are 12, and everything else, according to the Tanna Kama, Rav Yehuda is 10. So we have to first figure out, again, the Toida is 10, that everyone agrees to, the Nazir is 10, the Chavita Kohen Gadol is 12, the Lechem Aponim is 12, and the Shaila is everything else. So the Tanna Kama learns everything else from the Toida that it's 10. So the Gemara has to first find the source that Lechem Aponim is 12, Chavita Kohen Gadol are 12, and then the question is, why don't we learn out from it? So says the Gemara, Lechem Aponim behedik sibuhu, Lechem Aponim is before in the pasuk that it's 12. Chavita Kohen Gadol, how do I know Chavita Kohen Gadol? Is Aisha Chuk Chuk and Lechem Aponim. It's a Gzeir Shava comparing the Chavita Kohen Gadol to Lechem Aponim. Good. Now, everything is not learned out. According to the Tanna Kama, we don't learn out Shar Menachos from these. Why not? Call Menachos about Minala, and how do I know that all Menachos are 10? Gomer Malachme Toida. It's learned out from the Lachme Toida. Malalon Esraf Kan Esraf. Says the Gemara, according to the Tanna Kama, instead of learning out from Lachme Toida, why not learn it out from the Lechem Aponim, which are 12? The Leil Melachem Aponim. Why don't we learn out the standard mincha from the Lechem Aponim? And we say Malalon Shnei Esrei Afkan Shnei Esrei. So we have an option. We could learn out the standard mincha from the Toida that it's 10 of the Lechem Aponim, which is 12. So we're choosing the Toida according to Tanna Kama. Why not? Why not learn out from the Lechem Aponim? So the Gemara says, Mistabra Malachme Toida Havlamil. If it makes sense to compare the average carbon mincha to Lachme Toida, why? Shekain, because they're similar in the following ways. Yachid, they're both individual carbonos as opposed to Lechem Aponim, which is a communal carbon. Hamisnadi, they're both optional as opposed to the Lechem Aponim, which is a chiyuv. Shemen, they both contain oil as opposed to Lechem Aponim. Nifsel, they both get disqualified overnight as opposed to Lechem Aponim, which was a week to week. Shalei b'Shabbos, they're not brought on Shabbos, which is opposed to lechem aponim, which is brought on Shabbos, and shalei b'tumah, and they're not offered instead of tumah as opposed to lechem aponim. So these are the ways that they're comparable. And that's why we don't learn out from the lechem aponim. So Gemara says, Adarabba, lechem aponim v'lemelef. Adarabba, I should think you should learn out from the lechem aponim. Why? Shekain, because the standard mincha is similar to lechem aponim the following ways. Shekain hegdish, they're both kachi kachim as opposed to the toida, which is kachi kalim. Levina, they both compare frankincense. They contain frankincense as opposed to the lachmei toida. Matzah, they're both matzah as opposed to lachmei toida, which has chametz. And etzem, they're both brought on their own as opposed to lachmei toida, which is associated with it's bringing because of the carbon toida. So the Gemara says, Hanech nefishin. Although there are reasons to compare it to the lechem aponim, that is 1, 2, 3, 4 reasons. But the reasons to compare it to the toida is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 beats 4. Okay. Now, so we tried to learn it out from the lechem aponim, and we said it's not comparable. There's another set of karbanos that have 12, and that's the chavite kohen gadol, which are learned out from the lechem aponim. So the Gemara says, although we can't learn out the standard mincha from the lechem aponim, why not learn out the standard mincha from the chavite kohen gadol and say it's 12? Chavite kohen gadol learn out from the lechem aponim, so it's gzeir shava lechem aponim to chavite kohen gadol, and then learn everything else from the chavite kohen gadol. The Gemara says, Yisvir lan davar lam gzeir shava choizim lam binyan av. If you're comfortable learning out a binyan av, a comparable from something that's learned out from a gzeir shava, so neilif me chavite kohen gadol. You should learn out from chavite kohen gadol. Chavite kohen gadol learned out gzeir shava. It's lechem aponim chavite kohen gadol, and then learn out from the chavite kohen gadol. You tried to learn from lechem aponim, you couldn't. So learn out everything from chavite kohen gadol and say malon kanas eshtei se'af kanshe, and say that the average mincha should contain 12 loaves. It's the same question, but instead of saying we have a choice to compare it to the toida or lechem aponim, now it's toida or chavite kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, "Mistabra malach toida havel milf." It makes sense to compare it to the toida because, as we said before, they're similar in the following 6 ways: hedyet and isnadev. First of all, they're both actually they're a little different now. Because they have to be different than the chavite kohen gadol. First of all, hedyet, they're both brought by individuals as opposed to chavite kohen gadol, which is kohen gadol. Hisnadev, they're both optional as opposed to chavite kohen gadol, which is obligatory. Chatzon, they're not offered in halves. Chavite kohen gadol is half in the morning, half in the afternoon. Pigul, they both have the laws of pigul as opposed to chavite kohen gadol, which there is no matir because it's entirely burnt. There's no pigul unless there is a matir. You need something that the carbon allows the rest to be eaten, which you have by the toid and you have by the standard mincha. You don't have by the chavite kohen gadol. And shalei b'Shabbos, shalei b'tumah. They're not brought on Shabbos, they're not brought in state of tumah, as opposed to chavite kohen gadol. So these are the ways that it's more comparable to learn out from the chavite kohen gadol. So it says from the lachmei toidas. The Gemara says no. On the contrary, I have more reasons to learn out from the chavite kohen gadol. Adarabba, the chavite kohen gadol have l'melef shekain. The average mincha is more comparable to chavite kohen gadol, even more than the toida. Shekain isaron. They're both brought as an isaron as opposed to lachmei toida, which is more. Kli, they're both sanctified in a kli as opposed to lachmei toida. Hegdish, they're both kachi kachim as opposed to lachmei toida, which is kachi kalim. Levina, they both have frankincense as opposed to lachmei toida. Matzah, they're both matzah as opposed to lachmei toida, which is chametz. Etzem, they're both brought on their own, standalone carbon without being associated with an animal as opposed to lachmei toida. Hagasha, they all require hagasha being brought to the mizbeach. Ishim, they're all put on the fire as opposed to lachmei toida, which are eaten. V'hanach nefishin, and that's more reasons. So we have more reasons to compare the standard mint to chavite kohen gadol than the lachmei toida. So the Gemara says hedyet adafle. The answer is, although there are more reasons to compare it to the chavite kohen gadol, it makes more sense to compare the average mincha to a toida than the average, because they're both bought by commoners, they're non-kohen gadol, as opposed to compare it to the chavite kohen gadol. It doesn't make sense to compare something to the chavite kohen gadol, and therefore the Tanakama's reason of saying that the average mincha is 10 loaves is because we learn out from the lachmei toida and not from the chavite kohen gadol. So we've rejected lechem aponim and chavite kohen gadol. Now Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah disagreed. He actually says the average mincha is 12. Why? He either learns it out from lechem aponim or chavite kohen gadol. The things that we just rejected, he had no problem with. If he's comfortable learning after the chavite kohen gadol, and the reason why he compares he learns chavite kohen gadol over lachmei toida is because the chavite kohen gadol has more. As we just got finished saying, it actually has more reasons to compare this and the mincha to chavite kohen gadol. And Yisrael and Davar halam b'gzeir shava. And if he doesn't feel comfortable learning out the chavite kohen gadol, because chavite kohen gadol are only learned out from the lechem aponim, so he'll learn out straight from the lechem aponim. The lechem aponim doesn't have as many reasons to compare it to lachmei toda. Hekdish mehedish adavlei. He likes the learning out the standard mincha from the lechem aponim because they're both kachi kachim as opposed to lachmei toda, which is kachi kalim. And that, to Rameir, is more significant than numbers. Okay. Chutz melach meitoid nazir shem bar eser eser. The two karbanos that are definitely 10 lobes each is Toda and Naziris. Well, Lach Meitoda behegsibu. Lach Meitoda is Meforish. Damar Mar. And Naziris, Damar Mar. Shlamav, it says regarding the Toda, it says Shlamav l'Rabba Shalmei Nazir. The Pasuk describes the Shalamim of the Nazir in the paragraph of Lach Meitoda to tell you that the Toda and Naziris have the same halachos, that they're all 10 loaves each. Amrav Tumi Bar Kusne Amr Shmuel Lach Meitoda she'afan arba chalos yatsa. Now Lach Meitoda has 4 different types of breads, 10 each, so it's actually 40. What you do is you actually give one of each type to the kohen as the truma, and then you eat the 36. So it says the Gemara, if let's say a person does not actually bake 40 loaves, he only brings 4 loaves from home, one of each, he's yotza. Meaning, although he's supposed to bring 40, if he brings only 4 yotza, says the Gemara, habin and arba, I thought you need 40. The answer is la mitzvah. 40 is l'chachila, but the Yevid with 4. Okay, one of each. Here's the problem though. If it's one of each, how does he give truma? Now, you normally have 10, and you give 1 loaf to the kohen. You now only have 1 to start. So what are you supposed to do? You can't give it all to the kohen. So what are you going to say? Cut off a slice. The problem is, I'll say this also, we'll see it inside. The problem is, you have to give a full loaf to the kohen. You can't give a slice. So if you only have 1 of each, how are you yotze truma? Says the Gemara, and if you say that he just cuts a slice from each loaf, you have to give a kohen a full loaf. You can't give him a slice. So the answer is dafreshina belisha. The case is where you're mafreshin in dough, meaning he has the 4 doughs. He only brought 4 doughs from home. He pulls off a small dough from each, bakes a standalone bread for the kohen. So the kohen actually gets a full loaf, even though he only brought 1 of each. Meis ve'eva kasha. You're telling me that 1 is enough, even though you're supposed to bring 40. If you bring 4, you're fine. But doesn't the Brisa say not like that? The Brisa says, Kol hamenacha sheriba midas chalasan. If you brought too many loaves, or shemiyat midas chalasan ksheris, too many or too little are kosher. So far so good. Except lechem apanim, chavita kain gadol, the lachmei toda unaziris. Lachmei toda, you're not yotze if you bring too few. So you told me that if you bring 4 instead of 40, you're yotze by lachmei toda. The Brisa says first you're not yotze, because it says it's one of the exceptions where if you have the wrong amount of loaves, you're not yotze. So it's not like what Shmuel said. So the Gemara responds, who? Go to the next page. The Amar ki haitana. And it says Shmuel follows the other view. You're right, that Brisa is not like Shmuel, but keep reading. There's another Brisa. The Brisa says, the Tanya, if you have too many loaves or too few loaves, ksheros, chutz melechem aponim, this version, notice, lechem aponim v'chavita gengalo, no mention of toida. According to the Tanakama, toida is fine if you have too little. V'yesh omrim af lachmei toda naziris. But some say, if you don't have the right amount of loaves by toda, it's a problem. So Shmuel is following the first version of the Brisa, and not the Tanakama, not the Yesh omrim. Amravuna, minchas mafesh afachal achas. Similarly, if instead of 10 loaves of a minchas mafa, you only bring 1, you're yotza. My taima, what's the source? Matzis ksiv. Although it's read matzos, but it's written without a vav. So you see that even singular, even 1 loaf, you're yotza. Says the Gemara Maskler of Paprapos Zakasha, time dichsev matzos, haksiv matzos. Let's say it was actually written with a vav lo. That would mean that you have to have all 10. Wait, didn't we just got finished saying in the Brisa that said that if you have too little, you're yotza? Hagabi lachmei toda. Lachmei toda, it says, you tell me the reason why you can have too little is because it's written without a vav. But it's written with a vav, it's a problem. The toda is written with a vav. And didn't we just got finished saying that according to Shmuel, if you have too little, you're fine by the toda? Hagabi lachmei toda siv matzos. It says with a vav, which you're telling me now means it's a problem. Didn't Shmuel say that if you have too little, you're fine? So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, hey, pliga. The answer is, Rav Huna and Shmuel don't agree with each other. We just got finished saying it's a machlokes tanoim. It's Tanakam and Yesh Omrim. So Rav Huna and Rav Shmuel don't agree with each other. According to Rav Huna, if you miss out on some of the loaves, the lachmei toda, you're not yotza. Okay, new Mishnah. Ha'omer, the carbon omer that was brought in Pesach, ha'yaba isaron. It was brought in isaron of barley, mishalos sein, and they would actually start off with 3 saw of barley, and they would sift it down to an isaron. So you needed 3 saw to get to an isaron. But the shtei alechem, esronim mishalos saw. Shtei alechem, you were able to get 2 isaron from the same 3 saw. It's interesting. The Gemara is going to point out the reason being is very practical. The shtei alechem was wheat. The Omer was barley. barley has more chaff, so you need more barley to get to the same amount. Lechem aponim esem v'arba esronim me'esem v'arba son. And the lechem aponim, you were able to get 24 isaron from 24 saw, so there were much less impurities by the shtei lechem, by the lechem aponim. The Gemara will explain why. My time, why is this a mitzias? Why is this true? So the answer is, oimer is the hardest. Why? Keeping the chadash. First of all, it's chadash, so it has more chaff than the old crop, and also misaron, and it's barley, so it's chadash and barley. Then isaron muchar lo yasil mashalsin. You can't get a nice amount of isaron unless you have 3 saw. Shtei lechem. So that's the hardest because it's new and barley. Shtei lechem is wheat. So the Gemara says, "Keeping the mechita nasya avogado." It's new, but it's wheat. So it only has one of the difficulties that the Omer has, and therefore shtei aser nemasim mishalslin. But lechem aponim is old and it's wheat. Therefore, it's the easiest to sift. My taima keeping the mechita nasu miyashan nasu isar muvchar asi misa. Tana Rabbanon. Call Menachos sheriba b'midas isaron, or shemiyat b'midas isaron psulas. If any mincha you bring too much wheat, too much flour, or too little flour, you're not yotza. But riba b'midas son shalahan, miyat son shalahan ksheres. If you bring too much wheat or too little wheat, it's fine. Meaning, I get the same amount of isaron at the end, the right amount, but I needed to sift through more wheat than was prescribed, or too little wheat, and I was able to get it, you're yotza. As long as you get the right amount of flour at the end, you're fine. Too much flour, too little flour is a problem. But too much wheat or too little wheat is fine. As long as you get the right amount of flour at the end, you're fine. Last mish of the parak. Ha'omer ha'yumenufa b'shalosh esrei nafa. The omer, they would sift through 13 sieves. Shtei lechem b'shtei mesrei. This is all the rabbanon. This is practically the shtei lechem. They would use 12. The lechem aponim b'achas esrei, and lechem aponim were 11. Rashi brings down a pshat that this halachah meshmesina. Pashas, this is a takar d'Rabbanan. But Rashi does bring a halachah halachah meshmesina. The nafka would be if you didn't use the right amount of sieves. According to Tanakama, the first pshat in Rashi, you're fine. According to the second halachah in Rashi, it's halachah meshmesina. You're not yotza. Rav Shimon Omer loy hayelen kitzvah. Rav Shimon says there was no set amount of sieves. Elasoilus menufa called tzarcha yamevi. Rather, you would bring flour that had already been sifted. You could actually bring it from the shuk. You actually had to bring it from the shuk. According to Rav Shimon, you actually did not. There was no set amount of sieves, but rather for the lechem aponim. But rather, you could bring flour that had already been sifted. As we'll see in a moment. Meaning, according to Rav Shimon, you could just buy it from the market. You don't have to sift it a certain amount of times. As long as it's fine flour, it's fine. As long as the quality at the end is the same, it doesn't matter how many times you sift it through. You could even buy it from the store. Tana Rabbanan, regarding the sifting process, bedaka, begasa, bedaka, begasa. The flour was sifted through a fine sieve, then through a coarse sieve, then a fine one, then a coarse one. Shimon Elazar Omer, Shalosh Esrei Nafas HaMikdash. There were 13 sieves in the Beis HaMikdash. Zula Ma'ila Mezuz, Zula Ma'ila Mezuz. This one above that one, this one above that one. Meaning they were thick, like bigger, more coarseness. Elya and Kaleta Subin. The upper one would catch the bran. Tachtana Kaleta Silas, and it would go through all 13, and it would get to fine flour. Rav Shimon Amalaya and Kids, but Rav Shimon says there's no set amount of sieves. Tana Rabbanan, Silas va'afisa oisa. The pasuk says, hold on, this is regarding the lechem aponim, and it says Silas va'afisa oisa. Malamed sheniklas a Silas. The lechem aponim, you could buy fine flour. It's already sifted. How do I know that you could even buy wheat and sift it yourself? Meaning you don't have to buy fine flour. Now, meaning by the lechem aponim, which was a lot of bread and done weekly, you could buy fine flour or you could sift it yourself. You might think the average mincha you also can sift yourself. According to Rav Shimon, you cannot. According to Rav Shimon, you have to buy it already sifted because of the expense. So what this means is like this. According to Rav Shimon, the average carbon, we don't trust you to sift it yourself. You have to buy it already sifted. Now, the lechem aponim though, you had the choice to sift it yourself. Why? I thought we don't trust you. The answer is because it's expensive. So what does that mean? Fine flour is more expensive than sifting it yourself. For the average carbon, which is not as expensive, we don't trust you have to do it. But when it comes to lechem apanim, which was weekly and very a lot of flour, if the Beis Hamikdash wanted to sift it itself and not pay the expense, they're able to. Heicher Ramiza, what's the source? You give drink to the Klal Yisrael. We don't want Klal Yisrael to spend too much money. Hajj and Allah, Elu Menachos, Nikmatzos. I'll stop here.